There is a terribly mistaken notion floating around, haunting people. This religious-based notion that modesty, women dressing modestly, appearing modestly, is designed to protect men from unholy thoughts. Most people will say women should be modest wherever a man is around, whenever a man is around. That is so distasteful to begin with, and so wrong-minded concerning Jewish thinking. We have to assume that the Torah being divine, the laws being godly, we have to assume that if there is a law applied to a person, that law is for the benefit of that person. Like even with charity, you are obligated to give charity. What does that mean? That means that it certainly cannot harm you to give charity. On the contrary, it will elevate you to a much higher life form. Instead of being a taker, you become a giver. That's fantastic. It's fantastic. So it certainly cannot be a dismissal or a denial of the person to whom you're giving the mitzvah. So if a woman has the mitzvah of being modest, it cannot be for the sake of someone else. That would not be fair, that would not be just, it certainly would not be godly. So in principle, that thinking is wrong. But even when you look at the definition of modesty, the definition of modesty is to protect someone else from a bad thought. That's what modesty means? It doesn't. It doesn't. So, in trying to define precisely what modesty is, we have to develop a fine or refined sense of appropriateness. It's a subtle thing, and yet a very powerful thing. What is modest? Without a question, there are gray areas where you can argue both ways. It is modest, maybe not so modest. There are gray areas, of course. And that's great. You have to leave a little to the imagination, you have to leave a little to human judgment. And since we're talking about a sensitive subject, it depends on how sensitive the person is. Like, for example, halachically, if you're sitting at a table with people, you're not allowed to take a bite out of a sandwich, because the place where you took the bite out of may make some people squeamish. It looks bad. It was chewed. It was bitten. Right? Or even chewing with your mouth open. There are people who are very sensitive to that. You ruin their appetite. There's even a danger they might choke on their food. And this is literal. So you break off the bite-sized piece of the sandwich and swallow it that way. You don't take a bite out of a food, leaving the bitten results for people. So you can argue, we're not that sensitive. We all eat in public. We all eat carelessly with abandon. and nobody complains and nobody is choking on the food. You're not allowed to offer someone, your guest, for example, a drink from the glass you drank from, because they might be sensitive about that. Maybe they should be. They might be sensitive about drinking from a glass you drank from, but on the other hand, they're sensitive. They don't want to say no because they don't want to offend you. So they're going to force themselves to drink it and might literally choke. Now, you can argue that that's going a little too far. That's way oversensitive. It's almost paranoid. You're afraid that the person you're offering the glass to is going... But all it takes is one person to be that sensitive, and we've got a serious problem. So the Torah is dealing with subtle and sensitive and personal responses, instincts, and so on. And so there's no surprise that there's going to be some gray area. And of course, that's true of modesty as well. You ask someone a question about their life, about their relationship, even about their garments, and they are deeply offended. You had no intentions to offend. You didn't know that the person was sensitive to this thing. So the question is, which sensitivities in human beings should we be conscious of, should we take responsibility for, and not violate that border? So what constitutes an insensitivity? It's a very good question. Now, if you know that a person has a sensitivity, no matter how ridiculous that sensitivity is, you have to be considerate. In the physical realm, if you know that a person has a peanut allergy, as strange as that may sound to you, you've got to take it seriously. That's if you know the sensitivity that happens to exist. But the halacha deals with the rule rather than the exception to the rule. What is the rule? For the average sensitive human being, what constitutes immodesty? What constitutes modesty? I think we can all agree that today we have a very poor sense. We're very insensitive to modesty issues, particularly at home. We feel like we're exempt. We don't need to be modest at home at all. Yeah, it's my house. But again, modesty is as much for the benefit of the person being modest as for the sensitivities of those around you. The way you measure modesty in many cases is how it affects others. But it's not there to protect the others. It's there to elevate your own life, your own existence, to a higher, more sensitive or sensible level. So modesty means making fine distinctions, subtle distinctions, between the beautiful and the ugly, between the refined and the unrefined, between that which lifts the human spirit and that which deadens the human spirit. This is the subject of modesty, and it's worth every effort to get to understand it, to feel it, to appreciate it, and to develop it. If you're not a very sensitive person, you can develop the sensitivity. And as with any other area in life, there's always room for improvement. A more sensitive person is more alive. A less sensitive person is less alive. A more educated person is more alive. A less educated person is less alive. So it's really a refinement of life, an improvement of life, an elevation of life, beside bringing godliness into the human existence. Ultimately, modesty is a divine virtue. It's one of those things in which we imitate God. Just as He is compassionate, we should be compassionate. As He is generous, we should be generous. As He takes care of the poor, we should take care of the poor. In fact, we share that responsibility with Him. And the same is true with modesty. God is modest, and we should be modest. God makes a distinction between public and private, even in cases where it seems a little dangerous, like God saying to the Jewish people, "You of all people are mine." We have a separate relationship. I love all my creations, but you are my people. You are my firstborn. So God is making distinctions. And right at the beginning of creation, there was night and there was day. There was darkness and there was light. That's God's creation, distinguishing, discriminating between top and bottom, between up and down, between right and left, between holy and unholy. So, modesty is a study of life, and we need to have a good life. So the more sensitive we are to the subject of modesty, the more altruistic, the more pure our appreciation of modesty is. It's not a man versus woman or woman versus man issue. It's life. And of course, if you live life correctly and properly, everyone around you benefits. Whereas if you live life wrongly, it will have ripple effects in the wrong direction. So let's first of all get rid of this notion that women are modest because of men. Let's also get rid of this mistaken notion that men don't have to be modest. Modesty is a rule that applies to men and women. Why it's always applied to women and never to men is a really distortion of the whole mitzvah. For men, it goes so far as, now that men have worn a kippah, a yarmulke, traditionally for all these years, taking off the kippah is immodest. It's uncovering what should be covered. So the laws of modesty definitely apply to men as well as to women, even though some details might be different. A man's elbow may be exposed because he puts on tefillin in public. So you can't make it immodest to expose your elbow when you're doing it every day in shul. But that's about it. So, modesty applies to everybody. Modesty is not for the comfort or well-being of men who don't want to be distracted. That's their own responsibility, and you don't punish women for that. Thirdly, modesty is definitely not limited to dress. There's modesty in emotions. Don't spill your guts at every occasion. I once said to my mentor back in yeshiva, I said, "Can I talk to you? I need to get something off my chest." He says, "Why should you get it off your chest?" Maybe that's where it belongs. Maybe there are some things you need to keep private. Not just with clothing. So there's emotional modesty. There's even mental modesty. There's a famous story about a chassid who was a fantastic scholar, and particularly in the writings of the Rambam. And he was having a conversation with a non-Hasidic sage, and they were mentioning this particular quote from Rambam, and the chassid corrected the quote that the sage had mentioned. And they disagreed about the wording. So they sent someone to find the copy of the Rambam to look it up. When the Rambam arrived, when the volume arrived and it was being looked up, the chassid said, "Excuse me, I have to go to the bathroom." And he left the room. They looked up the Rambam, and it turned out that what the chassid had said was the right version. The non-Hasidic sage was very impressed. He said, I got it. He didn't need to go to the bathroom. He excused himself because he didn't want me to be embarrassed, because he knew that his version was correct. So he left the room so that my embarrassment would not be so painful. So there's modesty in many different ways, even about your opinion. And there's modesty in emotions, and there's modesty in social interaction. There's modesty in the way you sit. There's modesty in the way you walk. Body language can be very immodest, of course. So modesty is really a very complex, subtle slice of life. And we all know, maybe intuitively, we all know when we're talking to a modest person versus an immodest person. Even the tone of voice. And what is the difference, as subtle as it is? The respect for the borders or the lack of respect for the borders. Maybe this is pushing it a little bit, but there's certain people who speak a little louder than necessary. What is that? A need for attention, maybe? A desire to dominate the conversation, maybe? The point is, it's a violation of a border, right? There's a certain way to talk. You're sitting by a table talking to people. There's no need to shout. There's no need to be shrill. So violating a border means you're behaving in this context as if you were in some other context. That's called violating a border. And that, I think, is a good definition for inappropriate. So, that was inappropriate. What does that mean? What makes something inappropriate? Literally, it means that it was misapplied. You applied something to this context that really belongs in a different context. If we were arguing, then I could understand you raising your voice. But we're not arguing, so why are you raising your voice? So it's an inappropriate application of loud in a context that does not call for loud. So that, I think, is the bigger sense of modesty. Modesty means act appropriate to the context. Right? If you're not taking a shower, why are you running around as if you're in the showers? If you're not being intimate, why are you uncovering as if you were being intimate? That basically is the border that defines modesty. much of it does apply to men and women interaction, because there's a large border there, an important border there. There is modesty in the way, in body language, and there's modesty in the way you sit, the way you walk, the way you dance. These are all ways in which you expose who you are. And there are borders. When is exposure proper? What kind of exposure is proper? Under what circumstances is it? So we're constantly making these fine distinctions and fine choices. And that's what makes life beautiful, elegant. Our choices are not only between ugly and decent. Even within the decent, there is the more subtle elegance. There's the refinement of the decent. So modesty is certainly one of those more sensitive areas. If you just throw something on and you're not naked, you're pretty much modest. Why does it have to be any more complicated than that? It's because modesty is an art, not a crime. So yes, if you put something on and you're not naked, then you're not committing a crime. But that doesn't touch on the beauty, the elegance, the refinement, the godliness that life should have. We're not here to prevent crime. We're here to refine life, to elevate it from whatever level you're on. Even if you're on a very high level, you're always going upwards. Greater refinement, more subtle, more finer distinctions. That's what wisdom is all about. But if we want to appreciate what modesty really means, it takes some thought. Subtle thought, not political thought. This is not my rights. This is my sensitivity to the subtlety and the beauty of life. I don't know if that makes it easier or makes it more complicated, but it's worth a thought.